The land office in Russell, Kansas smelled of pine tar and old paper and the particular kind of dust that settled into wooden floors after a long drought. The clerk, a thin man named Hollis Pemberton, looked up from his ledger when the door opened and the August heat pushed in ahead of the woman who stepped through it. She was old. That was the first thing he noticed. Not old in the soft, comfortable way of grandmothers and painted portraits, but old in the way of weathered fence posts that had survived too many winters. Her face was lined with grief, the way limestone is lined with the memory of ancient seas. Her hair, what showed beneath a faded black bonnet, was the color of frost on iron. She was 62 years old, and she had walked into the land office holding the hands of two children, and she had nothing else in the world but $5 silver in the pocket of her dress, and the clothes on her back, and a carpet bag set carefully on the floor beside her boots. "I'd like to inquire about the Hendricks property," she said. Hollis Pemberton set down his pen. The Hendricks ruin had been a problem for the county for 2 years. It sat 300 yards west of town, at the edge of the prairie, four blackened limestone walls standing roofless against the sky. The fire that took the original homestead had been quick and complete. Some said a chimney spark in dry weather. Others said something less wholesome, debts unpaid, a man who had wandered out of his life and had found a way. Either way, the wooden roof had gone up like dry brush, and what remained was stone bones and a packed earth floor and the kind of silence that settled over places where bad things had happened. No one had bought it. No one had even asked. "Ma'am," Hollis said carefully, "that property isn't fit for habitation." The woman did not move. "Is it for sale?" "Technically, yes, but how much?" He hesitated. He looked at the children. The boy was about 10, dark-haired, watchful, with the kind of stillness that children only learn when they have lost too much too fast. Us. The girl was perhaps 5, blonde and small, holding the boy's hand the way a person holds a rope on a ship in heavy weather. $5, Hollis said. "But ma'am, you don't want it. The walls are blackened. There's no roof. The floor is dirt. Winter is coming, and out here winter." She placed $5 silver on the counter. They made a small sound against the wood, a sound like the ticking of a clock that had run down and was being wound again. "My name is Tabitha Ainsworth," she said. "I'd like to file the papers, please." Hollis looked at the coins. He looked at her face. He looked at the children. And then, because there was nothing else he could do, he reached for the deed. She had come from Pittsburgh. That was what she told the children when they asked, which was rarely. Pittsburgh, where the rivers met and the steel mills burned all night and the sky was the color of an old bruise. Pittsburgh, where her husband Edmund had worked stone for 40 years, had taught her to read the grain of limestone. The way other men read scripture had shown her how a wall holds itself together not by mortar, but by the weight and balance of what is placed where. Edmund had died in March of the previous year. Pneumonia, the doctor said, the kind that came in fast and took its time leaving and did not particularly care who survived it. 6 weeks after Edmund went into the ground, their daughter Susanna died, bringing her second child into the world. The child died with her. The first child, Ezra, 10 years old, had stood at the graveside and not made a sound. Tabitha had taken his hand, and he had led her, and they had walked home together to a house that suddenly held only ghosts and a 5-year-old girl named Hattie, who did not yet understand that her mother was not coming back. Susanna's husband had not waited for the spring. He had waited 3 weeks. Then one morning he was simply getting the children were Tabitha's, and the house was Tabitha's, and the debts were Tabitha's, and the whole arithmetic of a life that had once made sense was suddenly a column of figures that no longer added up to anything she recognized. She had sold the house. She had sold Edmund's tools, every chisel and pick and dressing hammer, and that had hurt more than the house. She had sold the wedding silver. She had sold everything that could be sold, and when she had the money in her hand, she had bought train tickets west because in Pittsburgh, she was a 62-year-old widow with 2 grandchildren and no future, and somewhere west of the Missouri, there was supposed to be land for the asking, and a person could start again, and old age was not a sentence but a circumstance. The journey had taken what was left. A wagon broke an axle in Selena. The repair took the silver. The food took the rest. By the time the train deposited them in Russell, Tabitha Ainsworth had 2 children, 1 carpetbag, and $5 silver. And the prairie stretched out before her in every direction, like the surface of a sea that had forgotten how to move. That was the morning she walked into the land office. That was the morning she bought a ruin. The walls rose 7 feet high on all 4 sides. They were 2 feet thick. The limestone was dressed in the old way, each block set against its neighbor, with the patience of a man who understood that stone forgives nothing and remembers everything. The fire had blackened the upper courses, smoke staining the rock, the way old age stains the lungs of men who have worked too long in mills. Tabitha stood in the center of the ruin on the morning after she signed the papers, and she did something that surprised her. She pressed her palm flat against the inner face of the eastern wall. The stone was cool. It was August. The sun was already hot enough at 9 in the morning to make the prairie shimmer. The packed earth at her feet was warm through the soles of her boots. The air carried the dry, hay-sweet smell of late summer, and somewhere a meadowlark was working through a song it had been practicing all season. But the stone was cool, almost cold, as if it remembered the night and was holding the memory carefully, slowly refusing to give it up to the day. Tabitha closed her eyes. She thought of Edmund. She thought of the cellar he had built beneath their house in Pittsburgh, dug into the earth and lined with limestone where the potatoes kept through winter and the milk stayed sweet through summer. She thought of how he had explained it to her, his big hands describing the principle in the air. Stone has memory, Tabitha. Earth has memory. They take in the cold or the heat slow, and they let it out slow, and a man who understands that can build a house that does the work of warming itself. Edmund had not built houses. He had built churches and bridges and the foundations of mills. He had been a journeyman, then a master, and his name was on a small bronze plaque on the side of a railway station in Allegheny County, though no one who passed through it would ever notice or care. He had taught her, though. Over 40 years he had taught her without meaning to, talking about his work at the supper table, showing her drawings, asking her to read the foreman's letters when his eyes got bad. She had learned the language of stone the way other women learn the language of flowers. She opened her eyes. She looked up where the sky stretched blue and merciless above the open walls, and she thought about a roof. Not a wooden roof. There was no wood for a wooden roof. There was no money for a wooden roof. There was no time to cut and dress and haul and assemble a wooden roof. And even if there had been all of those things, she did not know how to build one. But she had grown up watching her father, who was a farmer, cut sod from Pennsylvania bottomland. She had seen the soddies that the German families built west of town here in Russell Walls, of cut prairie laid up like brick. If a man could build walls of sod that held themselves up against gravity and wind, then a roof of sod laid flat on heavy timbers across the top of a stone wall might do what no one in Russell had thought to ask it to do. It might trap the heat that the stone walls would absorb during the day. It might hold that heat through the night the way the cellar in Pittsburgh had held its coolness. It might, if she was right, if the principle was sound, if the stone and the sawn and the simple physics of the prairie agreed to cooperate, keep 2 children alive through a Kansas winter. Tabitha lowered her hand from the wall. "Ezra," she said. The boy was sitting in a corner of the ruin watching her. Hattie was crouched near him, drawing patterns in the dust with a piece of charred wood she had found. "Yes, grandmother. We have work to do." He stood up without asking what kind. That was Ezra. He had stood up without asking what kind since the morning his mother died, and Tabitha did not know whether to thank God for it or to weep. The German came the next morning. His name was Silas Pickering, and that name had been in this country for 100 years. But his people had come from the Rhineland 4 generations back, and he carried the prairie the way men of that stock carried it, with a directness that had no patience for foolishness. He was perhaps 48 years old. He had survived 11 Kansas winters. He owned the soddy 300 yards east, and he was by general agreement of the township the man you asked when you did not know what to do. He stopped at the doorway of the ruin. He did not enter. "Mrs. Ainsworth," Tabitha was on her knees in the dust, sorting through the rubble, looking for any timber the fire had left behind that might still be sound. She looked up. "Mr. Pickering, news travels fast here." "So I hear." He looked at the walls. He looked at the sky, where a roof should have been. He looked at the children who had stopped working to watch him. "You bought this place." "I did. For $5. That was the price." Silas Pickering removed his hat. He turned it slowly in his hands. He was not a cruel man, and what he was about to say he had said before to other widows and other dreamers and other people who did not understand what the prairie did to those who underestimated it. "Mrs. Ainsworth," he said, "I have buried a great many people in this county. Most of them died of cold. They died because they thought they could make do, and the prairie does not negotiate with making do. Mr. Pickering, you have 8 weeks until first frost. Maybe 9. You have no roof. You have no fuel. You have no food stores. You have no livestock, no hay, no cellar, no way of cutting timber, and no timber within 15 miles to cut. You have an old woman's hands and a boy who looks underfed and a little girl who looks like a strong wind would carry her off." He put his hat back on. "By January, ma'am, it will be 30 below zero. The snow will be higher than your boy's head. The wind will come from the northwest at 50 miles an hour for days at a time. And this pile of rocks you have bought with its open sky and its cold floor and its blackened walls will be your tomb. You will freeze to death in it, and those children will freeze with you." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am telling you this because no one else will. Sell this property to the speculator who will come asking. He will come. He always comes. Take what he gives you. Take your grandchildren back to wherever you came from and live." The wind moved through the ruin. It moved through Tabitha's gray hair where it had escaped her bonnet. It moved through the gaps where windows would have been if there had been windows. She stood up slowly. Her knees were not what they had been at 30. "Mr. Pickering," she said, "thank you for your concern." "Mrs. Ainsworth, I will manage." He looked at her for a long moment. There was no contempt in his face, and that was almost worse than contempt would have been. There was only the patient, wary recognition of a man who had seen this before. "You will not manage," he said quietly. "I will be sorry for it, but you will not manage." He turned and he walked back across the prairie toward his soddy, and the grass closed behind him as if he had never been there at all. That night they slept on the bare earth, the 3 of them, with the August sky above them, and the stars hanging in their thousands, and Tabitha lay between her grandchildren, with her arms around them both, and she stared up at all that emptiness and tried to understand what she had done. $5, every cent she owned in the world, spent on 4 walls and a dirt floor, and a man's prediction for her death. Hattie was already asleep, curled against her shoulder. Ezra was breathing slow, but his eyes were open. He was looking at the stars. "Grandmother," he said, "yes. Will the man be right?" Tabitha thought about lying. She thought about all the gentle lies a person tells children who have lost too much, the soft assurances that everything will be all right, that the world is kinder than it seems, that grown-ups can manage what they say they can manage. Edmund had hated those lies. He had told her once that the worst thing a person could do to a child was teach them that the world was easier than it was, because then when the world arrived as itself, the child would have no tools to meet it. "He might be right," Tabitha said, "or he might be wrong. We are going to find out." Ezra was quiet for a moment. "What do you need me to do?" She turned her head. She looked at him in the starlight. 10 years old, the same age her own boy had been the year Edmund had taken him into the yard and put a chisel in his hand for the first time and showed him how a stone wanted to be split. That boy had grown up. That boy had become a man. That boy had been Susanna's father, and he had died of a fever in 79 before Susanna had married, and Edmund had wept for him in private and had not spoken of him again, and now there was only Ezra and only Hattie and only this. "Tomorrow," Tabitha said, I am going to tell you everything your grandfather told me about stone, and then we are going to build a roof. All right. It will be hard. All right. It will be harder than anything you have ever done. Ezra looked at the sky. He thought about that. All right, he said. Then he closed his eyes. And after a while, his breathing evened out, and he slept beside his sister, and Tabitha lay alone with the stars. She did not sleep until almost dawn. The first thing she did on the second morning was walk the inside of the walls again, slowly, carefully. She was not the woman she had been. Her back complained, her knees argued. But she walked the walls the way Edmund had taught her to walk, a structure looking with her hands, as much as her eyes pressing her palms against the stone, listening with her whole body. She found the marks on the third pass. They were small, almost invisible, cut into the limestone where the lower courses met the floor. Tiny chevrons, 3 of them, set in a triangle. Then at the corner where the eastern and southern walls met a single curved line, like a closed parenthesis. And on the western wall, hidden behind a crust of old soot, a deep-cut letter that looked like an ornate G. Tabitha sat down on the dirt floor. She sat down hard because her knees had given out, and she did not know if it was the heat or the grief or the recognition. She knew those marks. She knew them the way she knew the sound of her husband's voice. They were Edmund's marks. Not Edmund's exactly, but the marks of Edmund's Huttier, an old German named Gerhard Klein, who had taught Edmund the trade in the 1840s in a stone yard outside Allegheny. Klein had been an old man even then. He had cut chevrons into every wall he built, 3 of them set in a triangle the way some men sign their names. The closed parenthesis was his apprentice mark, used by men he had personally trained. The ornate G was the master's own. Klein had died around 1851. His apprentices had scattered. One of them, a man whose name Edmund had spoken once or twice, had gone west. Tabitha pressed her hand against the wall. The man who had built this ruin had been trained by the same master who had trained her husband 40 years ago, 2,000 miles away. And his hands had set these stones with the same patience and the same balance that Edmund had used to set the stones of bridges, and now those stones were waiting for her, and she knew because Edmund had taught her exactly how a wall like this was meant to carry a roof. She bowed her head. She did not weep because she had used most of her tears in Pittsburgh, and she did not have many left. But she sat in the dust of a ruined house, and she said very quietly, "Edmund." And the wall did not answer, but the wall did not have to answer because the wall was the answer. When she stood up while a woman who knew something, a great deal in fact. She knew that the walls had been built with what stonemasons called the dry crown, the upper courses tied together with longer stones laid horizontally so that the wall could carry weight. She knew that the corners were coined for load-bearing. She knew that the wall thickness, 2 full feet of dressed limestone, was excessive for a single-story house, unless the builder had intended from the beginning to put something heavy on top. The man who had built this ruin had built it for a sod roof. He had built it, and then he had declined or moved on or watched his house burn before he could finish, and the roof had never been built, and the house had become a ruin, and the ruin had waited. It had waited for her. She did not believe in fate. Edmund had not believed in fate. He had believed in stone and in patience, and in the slow accumulation of work done well. But she stood in the ruin that morning, and she felt for the first time since the pneumonia took Edmund that she was not entirely alone. She turned to her grandson. "Ezra," she said, "come here." He came. She knelt beside the marks. She put a small hand on the stone. She showed him the chevrons in the closed parenthesis in the ornate G. "Your grandfather's teacher made these marks," she said. "His name was Gerhard Klein. He taught your grandfather the trade in 1843. He taught the man who built these walls too. We are standing inside a stranger's house, but the stranger learned from the same teacher your grandfather learned from. Do you understand what that means?" Ezra looked at the marks. He traced the chevrons with one finger. "I'm not sure, grandmother." "It means," Tabitha said, "that I know what these walls are waiting for. I know what they want. I know how to give it to them." She stood up. It means we have a chance. The speculator came on the fourth day. Tabitha had spent the first 3 days surveying, walking, measuring distances with a length of rope she had found in the rubble, studying the angles of the walls. She had walked twice into Russell and back 4 miles round, and she had come back with a small notebook she had bought for 2 cents and a stub of pencil that Hollis Pemberton had given her without asking why she wanted it. The speculator's buggy raised a plume of dust as it came up the track. The horse was a chestnut gelding well kept. The buggy was clean. The man who climbed down from it was perhaps 45 years old, dressed in a dark wool suit despite the heat, his boots polished, his collar fresh. He had a face that had learned somewhere along the way to smile without using its eyes. Mrs. Ainsworth. Yes. My name is Jasper Cordell. I represent certain investment interests in Topeka. Do you? I understand you've recently acquired the Hendricks property. He looked at the walls. He did not look at the children. He looked at the walls the way a butcher looks at a steer calculating cuts. I'd like to make you an offer, he said. $8, cash today. That's 3 more than you paid. You can take your grandchildren back east. Settle yourself somewhere comfortable. Put this prairie business behind you. Tabitha did not answer immediately. She watched him. She watched his eyes, and she watched where his eyes went. They did not go to the walls, not really. They went past the walls. They went to the ground. He looked at the ground 3 times. In the first minute, he stood there. And not the ground inside the walls, but the ground outside 20 yards north of the structure, where the prairie grass grew thick over a slight depression in the earth. Why do you want it, Mr. Cordell? His smile did not change. His eyes flickered just for a moment. Excuse me. Mr. Pickering, my neighbor tells me I will be dead by January. Other people in town tell me the same. If I am to die in 3 months, why would you offer $8 for a property you can buy from the county for back taxes for 2? The smile thinned. Mrs. Ainsworth, I am offering you a kindness. I do not believe you are. The chestnut gelding stamped a hoof. A green bottle fly landed on the harness and was flicked away. The walls, Cordell said, recovering. The walls are good limestone. Limestone has value. The walls are not what you are looking at. His face went still. For just a second, the man behind the smile showed himself, and Tabitha saw what was there, and what was there was not kindness and not greed exactly, but the cold, patient calculation of a man who had spent his life watching other people fail and had learned to be patient about it. Mrs. Ainsworth, he said more quietly, take the $8. I do not think I will. You are making a mistake. I have made worse. He looked at her. He looked at the children. He looked for the first time at the ruin itself, and his eyes lingered on the corner where Tabitha had been studying the coin work, and something passed across his face that might have been recalculation. I will be in town through the end of the week, he said. If you change your mind. I will not change my mind, Tosh. He climbed back into his buggy. He turned the chestnut. He drove away, and the dust rose behind him and hung in the still air long after the buggy was out of sight. Ezra came up beside her. Grandmother. Yes. There is something on the ground over there. He pointed. North of the ruin, about 20 yards in the place where Cordell's eyes had gone 3 times. They walked over together. Hattie followed, curious now. The grass was thick, but Ezra had sharp eyes, and he had been watching where Cordell looked. He bent down, parted the grass, and pulled up a wooden stake. It was old, weathered gray. It had been driven into the ground perhaps 2 or 3 years before then, forgotten, or perhaps not forgotten, perhaps left as a marker for some future return. There were letters carved into the side of it, faded but legible. SB Survey, SAMP number 4, 14% NACL. Tabitha turned the stake in her hands. She had been a stonemason's wife for 40 years. She had read every letter that came to the house. She had read about the salt boom in central Kansas in 85 and 86, the discovery of vast underground deposits, the men in Topeka who had grown rich buying up homestead claims that sat above brine tables. She had read about how the speculators had moved fast, how they had bought distressed properties from widows and failed farmers, how they had sometimes encouraged distress where none yet existed because a desperate seller is a cheap seller and a dead seller is cheaper still. 14% sodium chloride. That was a brine sample. That was a sample taken from this ground. That was a sample taken from a survey conducted by someone whose initials were SB, who had been here before the fire, who had known what was under this dirt before the Hendricks place burned. The man who had built the walls, the student of Gerhard Klein, he had not just built a house. He had built a house above a salt deposit, and someone had known, and the house had burned, and the property had been forgotten by everyone except a man in Topeka who watched and waited and offered $8 3 years later to a 62-year-old widow who he believed would not live to see January. Tabitha closed her hand around the stake. She looked at her grandchildren. She looked at the walls. She looked at the prairie that stretched in every direction toward a horizon that was the color of beaten copper in the afternoon sun. "Grandmother," Hattie said. It was nearly the first thing the little girl had said in 3 days. "What is it?" Tabitha looked down at her granddaughter. "It is a reason," she said. "A reason for what?" "A reason," Tabitha said, "to stay alive." That night, she sat against the eastern wall with the stake across her lap and the children sleeping on either side of her, and she thought. She thought about Edmund. She thought about the chevrons cut into the lower courses. She thought about a stranger who had learned the trade from the same master and had come west and had built 4 walls above a salt deposit and had deed down or fled before he could finish his roof. She thought about Silas Pickering, who had told her she would die. She thought about Jasper Cordell, who had told her she would live, but only if she gave him what was hers. She thought about her granddaughter, who had spoken for the first time in 3 days, and her grandson, who had already become a man without her noticing. She thought about the 8 weeks until first frost. She thought about the roof she did not yet know how to build. And then slowly, calmly, the way Edmund had taught her to think when the work was hard and the time was short, she began to make a list. She would need timbers. There were no timbers within 15 miles, Pickering had said. But there had been a barn on this property before the fire. The barn had also burned. But Tabitha had walked the rubble, and she knew because Edmund had taught her that fire does not always destroy what it appears to destroy. The outer surface chars. The inner core remains. A heavy timber charred on the outside may still carry weight if the inner wood is sound. She would need a ridgepole, a long one, 16 feet at least. Cottonwood, probably from a creek bed. There were creeks within walking distance, if she could find them, and a borrowed horse to drag the timber and the strength to handle it. She would need rafters, 12, perhaps 15, smaller poles. The same creek beds would have them. She would need brush packed thick to fill the spaces between rafters before the sod went down. She would need sod, hundreds of square feet of it cut from the prairie in long ribbons, lifted onto the roof, 150-pound brick at a time. She would need a stove. There was none here. There was no money for a new one. But she had heard from Hollis Pemberton that there was a broken stove behind the Hendricks barn. Cracked firebox. No one had thought it worth saving. She would think it worth saving. She would need fuel. Wood cow chips, hay twisted into sticks. She would need stores enough to last from October to April. She would need help. She had no help. She had a 10-year-old boy with steady hands. She had a 5-year-old girl who had begun to speak again. She had a neighbor who had told her she would die, and a speculator who wanted her dead, and a town that had decided before she had even unpacked her carpet bag that she was a sad story already concluded. But she had something else. She had the marks on the wall. She had Edmund's voice in her ear, 40 years of it, telling her how stone wanted to be loaded, where weight should be carried, what a wall could hold and what it could not. She had a stake with letters on it that named the reason she had been chosen as prey, and she had the slow, cold understanding growing inside her like a small flame in a cold stove that being chosen as prey was not the same thing as being prey. A predator chooses you because he believes you are weak. The choice itself is information. The choice tells you what you have that he wants. The choice tells you that he will come back. Tabitha Ainsworth set the stake aside. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders. She looked up at the August stars in their thousands. She had 8 weeks. The wind moved through the open walls. It carried the smell of dust and grass and the faint, sweet rot of late summer prairie. It did not carry winter. Not yet, but winter was coming. And so for the first time in a year was Tabitha Ainsworth. The first timber took her a day and a half. It was 8 feet long and weighed somewhere north of 200 pounds, and it had been part of the rafter system of the Hendricks barn before the fire took the upper portion and left the timber half buried in the rubble. Tabitha found it on the morning of her 5th day in Russell, kneeling in the wreckage with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, pulling burned planks aside one by one until the prairie sun showed her what she was looking for. The outer surface was charred, black to the depth of her thumbnail. But Edmund had taught her how to test wood, and she scraped a long furrow along the timber with the edge of a flat stone, and beneath the char, the pine showed clean and yellow. The fire had blackened it, but had not gone through. It would carry weight. She wrapped a length of hemp rope around one end. She tied the other end around her own shoulders, padded with her shawl. She stood up, dug her boots into the dust, and pulled. The timber moved 6 inches. Then it stopped. Tabitha stood very still. She breathed. She felt the burn in her shoulders and the pull along her spine and the protest of 2 knees that had carried her 62 years and were tired now. She thought about Edmund. She thought about the chevrons cut into the lower courses of the wall. She thought about the stake with the letters carved into it. She pulled again. The timber moved another 6 inches. By midday, she had moved it 20 feet. By sundown, she had moved it 60. She slept that night in the wreckage of the barn rather than walk back to the ruin because she was afraid that if she stopped, she would not be able to start again. And Ezra came across the prairie in the gathering dusk with a tin cup of water and a piece of cornbread that Hollis Pemberton's wife had given him in town, and he sat beside her in the dust and said nothing while she ate. "Grandmother." "Yes." "I can pull too." She looked at him in the long blue light of the prairie evening. His face was thin. His shirt was patched at both elbows. "You can pull," she said. "Tomorrow." "All right." He lay down beside her. She put her shawl over him. The August night was still warm, but the warmth was leaving the air earlier each day, and she could feel the season turning the way a stonemason feels the grain of a block before he sets the chisel. In the morning, the boy pulled. By the end of the 2nd day, the timber was at the ruin. It lay in the dust beside the eastern wall, like the bone of some great animal. Hattie stood beside it and put her small hand against the charred end and announced with the gravity of a 5-year-old in the presence of something important that it smelled like fire. "It does," Tabitha said. "Are we going to put it on the house?" "Yes." "How?" "I will tell you when I know." Hattie accepted this. Hattie had become in the past week a small companion in the grand work of survival, and she did not require explanations the way other children did because she had learned the way Ezra had learned that explanations were not the point. The point was the work, and the work would explain itself when it was ready. The first man to come and watch was Silas Pickering. He came on the 7th day. He stood at the edge of the property line with his hands clasped behind his back, a tall, lean figure in dust-colored work clothes, his hat pushed back on his head. He watched Tabitha hauling water from the town well, a quarter-mile each way, twice a day. He watched her cutting weeds and grass from inside the walls. He watched her son Noah, her grandson, no longer a child the way he had been a week ago, sorting through rubble for stones that might be used to chink gaps. He did not approach. He watched for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he walked back to his soddy. He came again on the 9th day. He stayed longer. By the end of the 2nd week, he was coming twice a day, morning and evening, and standing at the property line and watching and saying nothing. Tabitha did not speak to him. She did not look at him. She felt his eyes the way a mason feels the eyes of an inspector, and she went on with her work, and she thought but did not say aloud that there were 2 reasons a man came back to watch a thing he had pronounced doomed. The first reason was pity. The second reason was something else. The widow came on the 10th day, and the widow did not pity. Her name was Prudence Caldwell. She was 41 years old, and her husband had been dead 3 years, and she lived a half-mile north in a frame house that her husband had built when he had been a man with plans and lungs that worked. The lungs had given out in '83. The plans had gone with them. Prudence had stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and because she said she had buried 2 children in the Russell churchyard and was not about to leave them to lie alone among strangers. She was lean and weathered, and her tongue was, by general consensus of every soul in town, sharper than any of the kitchen knives in her drawer. She found Tabitha on the road dragging a section of charred timber, and she stopped her wagon and got down and stood with her hands on her hips and looked. "You're the one who bought the Hendricks ruin." "I am." "For $5. That was the price." Prudence Caldwell nudged the timber with the toe of her boot. "Silas Pickering says you'll be dead by February." "He said January." "Did he?" "He did." Prudence looked at her for a long moment. She had a face that was used to expecting the worst of people and being right about it. "I came out here," she said, "to tell you that you are a fool." "All right. I came to tell you that you are going to drag those children into the ground with you, and that when you do, the rest of us will have to bury them, and that I personally do not have the patience to bury more children, having buried 2 of my own." "All right. You are not arguing with me." "No." "Why not?" Tabitha set down the rope. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at this woman who had come out into the prairie heat to call her a fool, and she saw beneath the sharpness what Edmund would have seen, which was a person who was trying to ward off a grief she had not yet committed to. "Because you are not entirely wrong," Tabitha said. "I am old. I died. I do not know how to do most of what I am about to do. I have no help, no money, no time. The man who built these walls is dead. Mr. Pickering is probably correct about my chances. So I will not argue with you, Mrs. Caldwell. I will only ask you a question." "Ask it. What would you have me do instead?" Prudence Caldwell opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the timber in the dust. She looked at the ruin in the distance with its open walls and its blackened upper courses, and the small figure of a 10-year-old boy sitting on top of one wall prying loose a stone that had cracked in the fire. "Damn you," Prudence Caldwell said, quietly, without anger. "Yes," Tabitha said, "I have thought so myself on occasion." Prudence Caldwell did not help, not that day, but she came back the next day with a jar of preserved peaches and set it on the wall without speaking, and she came back the day after that with a coil of rope used but sound and set that on the wall too. By the end of August, she had brought 3 meals, a wool blanket, a pair of work gloves that had belonged to her dead husband, and she had not on any visit said a single kind word. Tabitha kept the gloves. They were too large. She wore them anyway. The first frost came 12 days early. It came on the 14th of September, a thin, glittering crust that she found on the brush piled across her ridgepole when she stepped out of the ruin at dawn. The temperature was 28 degrees. The grass was stiff with white. The horizon to the north was the color of tin. She had not finished the roof. She had perhaps a third of the sod down. She had the ridgepole in place finally after 3 days of working with a borrowed plow horse and a system of ramps and ropes that had nearly killed her twice. She had 8 rafters set with 7 more to go. She had a layer of brush across half the rafters, no sod yet on the bare half, and the sky was visible above 2/3 of her house. 12 days early. She stood in the ruin with her bare hands red from the cold, looking up at the open sky, and she did the arithmetic she had been doing every night for a month. 8 rafters set, 7 more to go, 3 days each working alone more if the weather turned. 12 more days at the rate she had been going. 30 days for the sod if she was lucky, which she probably was not. 42 days total, 6 weeks. She had perhaps 4 weeks before hard cold. She stood with her hands red and her breath pluming in the gray dawn, and she felt for the first time since the morning she had pressed her palm against the limestone the cold edge of certainty that Silas Pickering might be right. She walked outside the walls. She walked perhaps 20 paces north. She turned and she looked at the structure, and she made herself see it the way Edmund would have seen it, not with hope, but with judgment. It was not enough. She walked back inside. She knelt down in the dust beside the surveyor's stake, which she had kept, and she set her hand on the chevrons cut into the lower courses, and she did what she had done as a girl in Pennsylvania when her father's farm had failed and she had not known how to tell her mother. She bowed her head, and she asked of nothing in particular, of Edmund, of the master mason whose marks were on the wall of the August dusts and September frosts in the prairie itself, for what she did not know how to give herself. She asked for help. The help came in three pieces, and the first piece arrived that afternoon, and his name was Silas Pickering. He walked across the prairie at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the sun had thawed the frost, and he stopped at the property line. And he looked at the unfinished roof, and he looked at Tabitha, who was up on a ladder she had built from scrap planks, lifting brush onto a rafter, with hands that were bleeding through the gloves Prudence Caldwell had given her. Mrs. Ainsworth, Mr. Pickering, you will not finish? I am aware. Silence. He shifted his weight. He took off his hat. He turned it in his hands the way he had turned it the first day, and Tabitha watched him from the ladder, and she did not come down, because if she came down, she was not certain she would have the strength to climb back up. Mrs. Ainsworth, Silas Pickering said, I've been watching you. I know. For 3 weeks. I know that too. He looked at the ridgepole. He looked at the rafters. He looked at the way the brush had been packed, which was, if he was being honest, the way a man trained in the old country would have packed it, although he did not know how a 62-year-old widow from Pittsburgh had come by the technique. My soddy, he said, I built it 11 years ago. I have seen it. It has a flaw. She did not answer. She set the brush. She climbed down the ladder slowly, one rung at a time, and she stood on the dirt floor with the cold sweat drying on her back, and she looked at him. What kind of flaw, Mr. Pickering? A weight-bearing flaw. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the ridgepole. The roof beam is undersized for the span. I knew it when I built it. I told myself it would carry. It has carried for 11 winters. But I have been watching the way you set your beam, and I have been thinking about the way mine sits on its walls, and I have been thinking about what would happen if a hard snow came on top of a hard wind, and the answer is that I do not know. Mr. Pickering, I am telling you this, he said, finally meeting her eye, because I have come over here every morning and every evening for 3 weeks to tell myself that what you are doing cannot work. And every morning and every evening, I have looked at it and I have understood slowly against my will that what you are doing is not what I thought it was. He paused. I do not know if your roof will hold, but I have come to believe that you know more about a roof than I do. And I came here today to ask you a question that I have not asked any human being in 11 years of Kansas winters. Ask it. Will you look at my soddy? The wind moved through the open rafters. Somewhere a meadowlark was calling, late in the season, a song that had a note of farewell in it. Yes, Tabitha said, I will look at your soddy tomorrow morning. Thank you. And Mr. Pickering, yes, you will help me set the next rafter today. He looked at her. For a moment, the prairie was very quiet. Then he set down his hat on the wall and he said, yes, ma'am. And he picked up the rope. The second piece came 2 days later, and the second piece nearly killed her. She had been on the ladder since dawn. The temperature had risen into the 40s, warmed by Kansas September standards, but her hands were not warm, and her arms had stopped feeling much of anything, and she was lifting the 83rd sod brick of the morning when something inside her chest went sideways and the world tilted. She came down the ladder. She did not remember coming down. She remembered Hattie's small hand on her face and Ezra's voice very close saying, grandmother, grandmother, and then she remembered nothing. When she opened her eyes, the sky was different. The sun was higher. She was lying on the dirt floor with her head on a folded shawl, and the shawl had not been there when she fell. Ezra was on the roof. She could see him through the open rafters. He was lifting a sod brick with both arms, his face red with strain, and he was setting it grass side down on the brush layer, the way she had shown him, the way she had stood on the ladder 100 times and demonstrated, and he was setting it correctly with the seam against the previous brick, and he was tamping it with the flat of his hand. He was 10 years old. He was setting the roof. Tabitha tried to sit up. Her arms shook. Hattie was beside her, kneeling, holding her hand. Grandmother, how long? Since the sun was over the wall. I do not know how long that is. 3 hours. 4 hours. The sun had moved across a quarter of the sky. Ezra, the boy looked down. His face was streaked with dirt. His hands were bleeding at the fingertips the way her hands had bled, and he had bound them in strips of cloth torn from the bottom of his shirt. Grandmother, you should rest. How many bricks? I do not know, some. Count them. He looked, he frowned, he counted, he did not count well. He had never had time for proper schooling, but he could count, and after a moment he said, 12. I have set 12. 12. A grown man working alone set perhaps 30 bricks in a day. A grown woman 15. Tabitha herself, in 3 hours of frantic work that morning, before her body had betrayed her, had set 18. A 10-year-old boy working alone with no one to hand him bricks had set 12 in 4 hours. Tabitha put her hand over her mouth. It was not from grief. It was not from pride exactly. It was from a thing that has no clean name in English. The particular thing a person feels when they understand that the work they have been doing alone has at some point they did not notice become work that someone else has joined, and that the someone else has joined it not because they were asked, but because they understood on their own that it needed doing. Grandmother, yes. Should I keep going? She looked at him for a long time. The boy on the roof of a house his grandmother had said could be built. The boy who had buried his mother and watched his father walk away and had not, in any of it, made a sound. No, she said quietly. Come down. We will work together. We will work until the sun goes. He came down. That night she could not sleep. She lay on the dirt with Hattie pressed against her shoulder and Ezra on her other side, and she stared up through the half-finished roof at the strip of sky that was still uncovered, and she thought. She thought about Edmund. She thought about the chisel he had put into their son's hands 50 years ago in a Pittsburgh yard. She thought about how that son had grown into a man and had died of a fever in '79, and how Edmund had wept in private, and how Edmund had said at the funeral only one thing, which was that the boy had been a good apprentice. That had been the highest praise Edmund had ever given. It had not been about the work. It had been about the love that was passed in the work. She turned her head. She looked at her grandson sleeping beside her, the small bandages on his fingertips dark with dried blood. She had thought when she came west that she was trying to keep her grandchildren alive. She understood now in the cold dark of a September night under a half-built roof that keeping them alive was only the surface of it. The deeper work, the work she had not let herself name, was what Edmund had done with her son in the yard 50 years ago. It was the passing of a thing. It was the giving of a craft and a way of standing and a way of meeting the world. It was the slow, secret transmission of 40 years of marriage to a stonemason into the hands and bones of a 10-year-old boy who had been chosen to receive it not because she had chosen him, but because the world had taken everyone else. She closed her eyes. She let herself weep finally for the first time since Pittsburgh, quietly so as not to wake the children. She wept for Edmund. She wept for her son. She wept for Susanna. She wept for the 3 years between Edmund's death and this prairie night, 3 years in which she had told herself she had nothing left to give the world. And she understood, lying in the dust, that she had been wrong about that. She had this. She had the marks on the wall and the boy on the roof and the work itself, and the work was not done. The third piece arrived on the third morning of October. Her name was Hester Brockway, and she was 71 years old. She came in a small two-wheeled cart pulled by an old mule, and she stopped at the property line, and she sat in the cart and looked at the ruin for a full minute before she climbed down. She moved slowly. Her hands were knotted with arthritis. Her face was lined the way old wood is lined with grain visible in every line. Tabitha Ainsworth. Yes. My name is Hester Brockway. I live 4 miles east. I am told you bought the Hendricks place and that you are putting a sod roof on stone walls. I am told several other things about you that do not need repeating. I have come to see for myself. Come in, Mrs. Brockway. The old woman walked into the ruin. She walked slowly. She walked the way Tabitha walked walls with her hands as much as her eyes. She put one knotted hand on the limestone. She looked at the ridgepole. She looked at the rafters, mostly set now, with brush packed across them and sod laid down across 2/3 of the span. She walked to the corner where the chevrons were cut into the wall. She knelt down. It was a slow business, the kneeling, but she did it without help. She put her hand on the chevrons, 3 small marks in a triangle, and she traced the closed parenthesis above them with one finger. She looked up at Tabitha. You know what these are? Yes. How? My husband apprenticed under the man who made them, in Pennsylvania, before the war. Hester Brockway closed her eyes. She stayed kneeling for a long time. When she stood up with one hand on the wall, and she did not look at Tabitha, and she said very quietly, I knew this man, not your husband, the man who built these walls. His name was Anders Holm. He was my brother. Tabitha did not speak. He came west in '74, Hester said. He had learned the trade from Klein. He bought this property in '83, and he built these walls in the summer of '84. He meant to put a sod roof on them. He had drawn the plans. He had cut the timbers. He had done everything but the lifting. She paused. Her voice was even, but only just. He died on the 3rd of November in 1884. He was working in the rubble of his own barn after the fire. A timber fell on him. He bled to death before they could get him to a doctor. He was 46 years old. He had no children. He had no wife. He had only his sister, who lived 4 miles east, and who was too old by then to come over and help him build the roof he had planned, and who had told him the last time she saw him that he should hurry because winter was coming. She looked at Tabitha. I have come every spring for 2 years, Hester Brockway said, to look at what my brother left behind. I have stood at the property line and I have not gone in. I am an old woman. I have outlived 2 husbands and 4 children and a brother. I did not want to walk inside the walls he never finished. Mrs. Brockway, I came today because Prudence Caldwell told me that a Pittsburgh widow had bought the place and was putting a roof on it. I came because Prudence Caldwell is a difficult woman and I trust her, and she does not lie about important things. And I came because I have been waiting without knowing I was waiting to hear that someone had finished what my brother started. She put her hand on the wall again. The knotted, arthritic hand. She held it there a long time. You are finishing it. I am trying. You will finish it. Mrs. Brockway, I have 8 days, perhaps 10 before hard cold, and I have 1/3 of the sod to set and a stove to faint and patch and fuel to gather and food to buy that I have no money to pay for, and I am 62 years old and I am alone. You are not alone. Tabitha looked at her. I have a cellar, Hester Brockway said. It has been full for 30 years. My husband's like to put up food and my children helped, and most of them are dead now. And I am one old woman, and I will not eat through what is in that cellar in another 5 years if I live that long. I have salt pork, I have potatoes, I have onions, I have flour and cornmeal and lard. I have iron cement 2-can seal that my second husband bought in '78 and never used. I have a stovepipe and 3 good lengths of joint in a small chest of carpenter's tools that belong to my brother. She paused. I have one thing more. What is that, Mrs. Brockway? The old woman looked at her. Her eyes were very pale, the color of well water in winter. I have a sickness, she said. I do not know what the doctor calls it. I know what it is. It started in the spring. It has been getting worse. I will not see another summer. I have one good fall left and one hard winter to get through, and that is all. The wind moved through the open rafters. Mrs. Brockway, do not, do not say what people say. I am too old for it, and I have heard it too many times. I am telling you this because you have a right to know what you are accepting. If I bring you my cellar and my brother's tools and the iron cement, I am bringing you a debt you cannot pay back because I will be in the ground before you can pay it. So I am telling you what the debt is. The debt is that you will finish my brother's house. The debt is that you will use what I am giving you to keep those children alive. The debt is that when you are a very old woman, older than I am now, you will tell someone the story of two old women who built a roof in 1886, and you will not leave me out of it. Tabitha could not speak. Do you accept? Hester Brockway said. Yes. Then I will go home and load the cart. I will be back tomorrow with the first load. We have 8 days, you say? Yes. That is enough. She walked back to her cart. Slowly, she climbed up. She turned the mule. She drove away across the prairie, and the wheels of the cart left two thin lines in the dust that the wind would erase by evening. Tabitha stood inside the walls. Ezra came up beside her. Hattie came up on the other side. They had heard most of it. They had said nothing. Grandmother. Yes. Is that woman going to die? Yes. Are we going to die? She looked at her grandson. She looked at her granddaughter. She looked up at the sky through the third of the roof that was still open to the prairie sun. Not this year, she said. How do you know? She thought about that. She thought about it carefully, the way Edmund had taught her to think about questions that mattered. I do not know, she said. I believe. The roof was finished on the 7th of October. It was finished in the late afternoon with the sun low and red in the west and the wind blowing cold from the north, and the last brick of sod was set by Hester Brockway, kneeling on the roof with her arthritic hands, while Tabitha steadied her from below and Ezra handed her the brick. Hester tamped it into place. She sat back on her heels. She looked across the 8 inches of packed prairie that now covered 320 square feet of ruin. It will hold, she said. It will hold. The two old women looked at each other across the finished roof of a house that one of them had bought for $5 and the other of them had outfitted from a 30-year-old cellar, and neither of them smiled because the work was not the kind that asked for smiles, but they looked at each other and they understood each other, and that was enough. Hester Brockway died on the 14th of November. She died in her own bed in her own house 4 miles east. Prudence Caldwell was with her at the end. So was Tabitha, who had walked the 4 miles in a thin, cold rain to be there. She left Tabitha 3 things in her will. The first was the remainder of her cellar. The second was a small wooden box of carpenter's tools that had belonged to Anders' home, including a stone chisel with a maker's mark cut into the handle, 3 chevrons, and a triangle. The third was a folded paper sealed with wax with the words, "For Tabitha on the day you need it," written across the front in a careful, upright hand. Tabitha did not open the third thing. She put it in the bottom of her carpet bag, and she did not look at it again that fall because she did not need it yet. She did not know on the day Hester Brockway was buried that she would need it. She knew only that an old woman she had known for 43 days had left her a sealed letter, and that she would open it when the day came that she could not solve a problem on her own. That day was coming, but it was not yet. The stove was installed on the 19th of October before Hester died. The cracked firebox was patched with iron cement, 2 layers set hard for 3 days, and then fired slow. The fire took on the first try. The smoke went up the pipe and through the hole Tabitha had cut in the sod roof, and the cracked mica window in the stove door glowed a deep, dim orange. And Hattie stood very close and pressed her hands toward the heat and said with the same gravity she had used about the burned timber that it smelled like home. It did. Jasper Cordell came back on the 2nd of December. He came in a different buggy, this time a heavier one with a leather hood pulled up against the cold. He came with a thicker coat and gloves and a black wool scarf, and he stopped at the property line, and he climbed down and he walked to the door of the structure that Tabitha had built, which was no longer a ruin, but was not yet a house, and he knocked with one gloved hand on the plank door. Tabitha opened the door. Behind her, the stove was burning. The room was warm. Hattie was at the table drawing letters on a slate Hester Brockway had left her. Ezra was at the wall mending a tear in a wool blanket with a needle and thread. Cordell looked past Tabitha into the room. His face did not change. It was very, very controlled. Mrs. Ainsworth, Mr. Cordell, it appears you have made progress. It appears so. I have come to make you another offer. She waited. $20, he said, and a railway ticket east, to any city you name. Pittsburgh, if you like. I will purchase it personally. The offer is good for 1 week. She looked at him. She looked at the cold prairie behind him and the gathering cloud in the northwest and the way the wind was beginning to take the dry top dust off the ground in long, pale ribbons. Mr. Cordell, she said, I am going to ask you a question. I will ask it once. I will ask it with no anger and no pleasure, because I have neither to give. Do you know a man named Anders Holm? He did not answer. The wind moved a piece of his black wool scarf. Or a man named S.B., she said, who took a brine sample from this property in the spring of '84. He did not answer. I did not think so, she said. Or rather, Mr. Cordell, I think you did. I think you do. I think that is why you are here. She closed the door. Not slammed. Closed. Carefully, the way a person closes a door on a draft. She turned. Ezra was watching her. Hattie was watching her. The stove was burning low and steady, and the stone walls were warm, and the solid roof was holding its weight without complaint. Grandmother, Ezra said. Yes. Was that the man from before? Yes. Will he come back? She thought about that. She thought about it the way Edmund had taught her to think about hard questions, which was slowly and without fear, and with a willingness to say what was true, even when what was true was difficult. He will come back, she said, once more, I think, after the worst of it, when he believes there is nothing left of us to argue with him. What will you do then? She looked at the carpet bag in the corner, the folded letter at the bottom, the wax seal she had not yet broken. I do not know yet, she said, but I have been given by a woman I knew for 43 days the answer to a question I have not yet been asked. When the question comes, I will open the answer. Until then, I will not. That was her wish. She sat down at the table. She picked up the slate. She turned to Hattie. Show me your letters, she said. The little girl did. The stove burned. The sod held. Outside, the prairie wind began to rise, and the first hard cold of December settled in for the winter. And Tabitha Ainsworth, 62 years old, widowed almost penniless, living on the charity of a dead woman's cellar, and a difficult neighbor's preserved peaches, and her own grandson's bleeding hands sat at a plank table inside walls she had bought for $5, and she watched her granddaughter draw the letter A on a slate, and she thought but did not say that the worst was still ahead. The worst was 4 weeks away. It would arrive on the morning of the 6th of January, and it would test every stone in the wall, and every brick of sod on the roof, and every piece of charity in the cellar, and every ounce of stubbornness in the bones of an old woman who did not know how to quit. She did not know any of that yet. She knew only that her granddaughter had drawn an A and an E and an H, and that the H was for Hester, and that Hester had been right about the roof. The roof was holding. For now. The sky on the 5th of January was the wrong color. Tabitha noticed it at first light when she pushed open the plank door to fetch the water bucket she had left under the eave. The bucket was glazed with ice, an inch thick across the top. The air bit her face the way iron bites a hand stuck to it in winter. She looked north automatically the way she had learned to look north in her 4 months on the prairie, and the sky was a color she had not seen before. It was not gray. It was not blue. It was the pale, dirty yellow of old bone low along the horizon with a darker bruise rising behind it, and the wind that came off it was so dry it cracked the inside of her nose. She stood in the doorway with the ice bucket forgotten beside her boots, and she understood with a clarity she did not want that something was coming that the prairie had been holding back. She closed the door. She walked to the stove. She set another piece of cottonwood into the firebox. She did not wake the children. She stood for a long time with her hand on the warm iron of the stove, feeling its heat through her palm, and she counted in her head the things she had stockpiled. 3/4 of a cord of wood dragged from the creek bed and split with a borrowed axe stacked against the eastern wall. 2 wagon loads of dried cow chips under canvas behind the structure. 40 pounds of cornmeal. 20 pounds of dried beans. A small barrel of salt pork. A sack of potatoes. 8 twists of hay she had bound the previous evening just for practice. It was not enough. Silas Pickering had told her in November that it was not enough, and Hester Brockway had told her before she died that it was not enough, and Tabitha herself had known it was not enough, since the morning the first sod went down in October. The arithmetic of fuel did not work. There were 3 of them. The stove burned wood at a known rate. The worst of January was always longer than the worst of December. And the math came up 2 weeks short, and there was no way to make the math come up otherwise without hay or coal or chips she did not have. She had been hoping quietly that the winter would be mild. The sky on the morning of the 5th of January told her that it would not be mild. She turned from the stove. She looked at her grandchildren sleeping in the pile of blankets nearest the heat. Ezra had grown an inch since October. Hattie had grown enough that her sleeves no longer covered her wrists. They had eaten less than children ought to eat. They had not complained, which was somehow worse than if they had. "Lord," Tabitha said very quietly, the way she had said it as a girl in Pennsylvania when she did not know what else to say. "Lord, I have done what I could do. The rest of it is yours." She did not believe in a God who sent storms. She did not believe in a God who answered prayers in any way she could measure. She believed in stone and in patience, and in the slow accumulation of work done well, and she believed faintly in something larger that she did not have a name for. She believed in it more that morning than she had the morning before. The snow began at noon. It began the way bad snow begins on the prairie. Not as snow exactly, but as a thickening of the air, a haze that crept in from the north and turned the sky the color of dirty milk. By 1 o'clock, the first flakes were sliding sideways past the small window Tabitha had set into the southern wall. By 2, the flakes were not flakes anymore, but a solid moving wall of white that erased the world beyond 10 feet. By 3 o'clock, the wind had risen to a sound Tabitha had never heard before. It was not a howl. A howl was a dog sound, a thing that began and ended. This was a low, continuous roar, the noise of a freight train that did not pass a thing that arrived and stayed and went on, arriving with shrieks and moans inside it, where the wind found gaps in the world and forced itself through. The temperature at 3 was 12 above zero. At sundown, it was 15 below. At midnight, when Tabitha rose to feed the stove for the 3rd time, the small thermometer Silas Pickering had given her in November read 34 degrees below zero, and it was still falling, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. Inside the walls, the temperature held at 38. She had never been so grateful for a number in her life. The storm did not stop on the 6th. It did not stop on the 7th. By the morning of the 8th, Tabitha had lost track of which day it was. She knew only the rhythm of the stove. Every 2 hours into the firebox. Every 2 hours check the children's breathing. Every 2 hours twist a fresh handful of hay into a stick that would burn for 40 minutes if she packed it tight. Every 2 hours scrape the frost off the inside of the small window so she could see briefly that the world was still there, and that the world was still white, and that the wind was still screaming. She slept in 15-minute pieces, sitting upright against the warm stone of the eastern wall. Ezra woke when she woke. He helped her twist hay. His 10-year-old hands were steadier than hers by the 3rd day, his fingers nimbler. His technique better than the technique she had taught him. He did not complain. He did not ask when the storm would end. He twisted hay and stacked sticks and watched the fire with the intensity of a child who understood as well as any adult exactly what was at stake. Hattie slept most of it. That was the small mercy. On the morning of the 9th, the wind dropped for the first time. Tabitha did not believe it at first. She sat very still beside the stove and listened, and the silence was almost a noise of its own, a held breath. Then she stood up and she pushed the door open against the snow that had piled against it, and she stepped outside. The world had been remade. The drifts rose 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet in places. The path to town was gone. The path to the Pickering Soddy was gone. The thermometer beside the door read 41 below zero. The sun was a small, pale disk somewhere to the east behind a sky that was the color of a cataract, and the air was so cold that it hurt her teeth to breathe through her mouth. She closed the door. Grandmother Ezra said, "Is it over?" "It has stopped," she said. "That is not the same as over." She was right. By noon, the wind was rising again from the northwest, and by mid-afternoon, the snow was falling again, and the second half of the storm came on harder than the first. The knock came at 3 in the afternoon on the 9th. Tabitha did not believe it at first. No one knocked. No one could reach her door through 10-foot drifts at 40 below. She thought for one foolish second that the wind had moved a board against the wall, and she sat with her cold hands pressed against the warm iron of the stove, and she waited for the sound to repeat itself. It repeated. It was not the wind. She walked to the door. She picked up the axe she kept beside the stove, because 4 months on the prairie had taught her things. She set the head of the axe against the door just below the latch, and she said, "Who is it?" A voice from the other side. "Pickering." She lowered the axe. She unhooked the latch. She pulled the door open against the wind, and Silas Pickering nearly fell across the threshold. He was a man covered in ice. His beard was a solid plate of frost. His coat was sheeted with frozen snow that cracked when he moved. His eyes were the only living thing in his face, and the eyes were wild. Behind him, barely visible in the swirling white, were 2 small figures. His son Joseph, who was perhaps 8. His daughter Eliza, who was perhaps 5. They could not walk. He had been carrying them one in each arm for the last quarter mile. Tabitha did not waste a second. "Inside, now, all 3 of you." She pulled them in. She slammed the door against the wind. She stripped Silas Pickering's frozen coat off him and dropped it in a heap. She knelt and pulled the children's outer layers off mittens, stiff as wood scarves frozen to their faces. Their lips were blue. Their eyelashes were crusted with ice. They were shaking so hard they could not stand. Ezra was already moving. He had pulled blankets from the pile, the warmest ones, and he wrapped them around the Pickering children without being told. Hattie, awake now, made room beside the stove without being told. The 2 old soddy children sat down where Hattie had been a moment before, and Hattie pressed close to little Eliza without thinking about it, sharing her own body heat the way an older sister shares it with a younger one. Although Hattie was not older, only better off. Silas Pickering sank to the floor against the wall. He could not stop shaking. Tabitha put the kettle onto the stove. She poured hot water into a tin cup, added a spoonful of cornmeal. To thicken it, pressed the cup into his hands. He took it with hands that did not work properly. Most of the first sip went down his beard. "Mr. Pickering." He could not answer. "Mr. Pickering, where is Mercy?" His face came apart. It came apart not the way men's faces come apart in stories all at once, but the way a stone comes apart in a freeze, one slow crack at a time. He looked at the stove. He looked at his children. He looked at his hands. "The roof," he said. "The roof went." When? "This morning, maybe last night. I do not know what time. The snow on top and the wind in the beam was undersized. You know, it was undersized. You said so in October, and I said I would brace it, and I did brace it, but not enough, and it came down on the east end." Mercy? She was at the east end. There was a long silence. The wind screamed against the door. "She pushed me," Silas Pickering said. His voice was very quiet. "When the beam went, I was nearer the wall. She was nearer the door. The east wall came in and the snow came in with it, and there was a moment before the rest came when she could have gone for the door. She did not. She turned around. She put both her hands on my chest and she pushed me toward the children and she said, "Run." Silas, run, and she went back into the kitchen for a quilt to wrap them in. The kitchen was the east end. He was not looking at Tabitha anymore. I should have gone after her. I should have. I had the children in my arms, and I could not put them down. The snow was coming in, the cold was coming in, and the only thing I could think was that if I put them down to go after her, all four of us would die in there. And I do not know if that is the truth or if that is what I told myself. I do not know. I do not know which it was. He bowed his head. I did not come here to be saved, Mrs. Ainsworth. I came here because my wife is dead under our roof, and I could not stand inside what was left of the soddy with my children watching me, and I did not know where else to go. I followed your smoke, the chimney smoke. It was the only thing I could see in the white. I walked toward it because there was nowhere else. Tabitha put her hand on his shoulder. She did not say it was not his fault. She did not say there had been nothing he could do. She did not say because Edmund had taught her not to lie about the dead that Mercy Pickering would have wanted him to come. "Mr. Pickering," she said. "Yes." "Your children are alive." "Yes." "Your wife saved them." "Yes." "You will tell them when they are old enough what she did. You will tell them every year. You will tell them the way it was not the way it would be easier to tell. That is what is owed her." He looked up. "I will. Then drink the water and feed your children. And we will sit down and we will get through tonight and tomorrow and the day after that. There are 7 of us in this room now. The walls will hold for 7. "Mrs. Ainsworth." "Yes. I told you in August that you would die." "You did." "I was wrong." "Yes. I was wrong about everything. Mr. Pickering, drink the water." He drank the water. The 7th person came on the morning of the 11th. The storm was still on. The wind had not stopped for 60 hours. Tabitha was rationing fuel to the point where the stove was burning at embers between feedings, and the temperature inside the walls had dropped from 38 to 32. And she had begun to look with a careful blank face that she did not let the children see at the wooden frame of the door, and the planks of the table, and the rungs of the ladder Ezra had built from scraps in October. She had broken the ladder up into kindling on the night of the 10th. The door frame would go next, then the table, then the planks beneath the door. Then she did not know what. The knock at the door on the morning of the 11th was not so much a knock as a body falling against it. Tabitha pulled the door open, and Prudence Caldwell fell across the threshold and did not get up. She was not wearing a coat. She was wearing a house dress and a wool shawl and one boot and one slipper. Her face was white with frostbite. There was ice in her hair and her eyelashes, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. The only reason she was alive at all was that Tabitha's chimney smoke had given her something to walk toward, and she had walked the half-mile from her own house through 45 below cold in a house dress in one slipper, and she had made it. Prudence. Burned. That was all she said. The single word. Tabitha and Silas Pickering pulled her inside and stripped the ice off her and wrapped her in the last dry blanket and pressed her toward the stove, and Prudence Caldwell sat shaking on the dirt floor and stared at the fire and said after a long time, "Chimney went. Could not put it out. Whole house took. I came toward your smoke. You walked here." "Yes. In a house dress. There was no time." She started to laugh. A terrible, dry, cracking laugh that turned halfway into a sound that was not laughter at all. Tabitha held her. Silas Pickering looked away. Hattie crept close and put her small hand on Prudence Caldwell's frostbitten cheek, and Prudence, who had told Tabitha in August that she did not have the patience to bury more children, closed her eyes and leaned her face against the little girl's hand. "I told you you were a fool," she said very quietly to Tabitha with her eyes still closed. "You did." "I was the fool." "No, I was Tabitha." "No, Prudence, we were both right and we were both wrong, and we are both alive. Drink this water." Prudence drank. There were 8 of them now, 8 people in 320 square feet. 8 people with fuel for, by Tabitha's count, 3 more days. She did not say so out loud. She did not have to. Silas Pickering had been doing his own counting since he came through the door, and he met her eye over the top of Prudence Caldwell's head, and they both knew and they both said nothing because the children were listening. Tabitha got up. She walked to the corner where her carpet bag had sat untouched since October. She knelt down. She opened the bag. She took out from the bottom the folded paper sealed with wax, with the words, "For Tabitha on the day you need it," written across the front, in Hester Brockway's careful upright hand. She broke the seal. The folded paper opened in her hands, and Tabitha sat on the dirt floor of her own ruin and read what an old woman dying in November had written for her to find on the day she could not solve a problem on her own. It was 3 pages. The first page was a deed. It was for 40 acres of prairie recorded at the county seat in 1881 in the name of Hester Brockway, free and clear of any encumbrance. The 40 acres lay directly north of Tabitha's property between her ruin and Silas Pickering's collapsed soddy. It was a strip of land that no one had ever seemed to care about that had been part of Hester's family holdings for 30 years, and that according to the small map Hester had drawn in pencil on the back of the deed, contained the only access route between Tabitha's property and the road that ran east toward Topeka. The second page was a letter from a lawyer in Salina, dated August of 1886, 3 weeks before Tabitha had stepped off the train in Russell. It was a notarized statement, witnessed and sealed, that confirmed Hester Brockway as the lawful owner of those 40 acres, and that recorded a separate fact, a fact that had nothing to do with farming or with grass. It recorded that Anders Holm in the summer of 1884, in the months before he died, had filed a claim with the territorial mineral surveyor for the rights to any salt deposit lying beneath his property and the adjacent 40 acres of his sister's. The claim had been filed correctly. The fee had been paid. The paperwork had been notarized in Topeka on the 22nd of August, 1884. The claim was active. It had never been challenged. It had never been transferred. It had passed on the death of Anders Holm to his sole surviving heir, who was Hester Brockway. It had passed on her death in November of 1886 by the terms of her will to Tabitha Ainsworth. Whatever salt lay beneath the Hendricks ruin and the strip of land north of it belonged by law to Tabitha. The third page was a short letter from Hester herself. It was 3 paragraphs long. Tabitha read it twice. She did not read it aloud. She folded it back up very carefully, and she tucked it inside her dress against her chest, because there are some things that are not for anyone else's eyes. She knelt for a long moment with her hand pressed against her chest where the letter sat. Then she stood up. "Mr. Pickering," she said. "Yes. When this storm ends, and when we have buried Mrs. Pickering, and when we have all eaten a proper meal, we will go to town together, you and I and Mrs. Caldwell. We will walk to the office of the county recorder, and we will file 3 pages of paperwork that I have just been given, and we will sign one statement together, and we will end a thing that has been waiting to be ended for 2.5 years. Silas Pickering looked at her. "Mrs. Ainsworth, I do not understand." "You will, when we walk to town." "Is it about the man Cordell?" "It is. He came to my house, too, in September. He offered me money for my soddy." "I know. You know. He offered the same to Mrs. Caldwell. I am told he offered the same to 4 other widows in this county. Some of them took it. 3 of them are dead this week by my reckoning, although we will not know for sure until the storm is over. The walls he wanted are mine, Mr. Pickering. The land beneath them, also mine. He has been waiting since '84 for someone to die in this house so he could buy it cheap from the county. Hester Brockway knew him. Her brother knew him. They have left me what I need to end it." Silas Pickering stared at her. "Anders Holm was Mrs. Brockway's brother." "Yes." "The man who built these walls." "Yes." "And he had a salt claim." "He had a salt claim. Mr. Cordell has in 3 years never thought to check whether anyone else had filed first. He thought he was waiting for a dead man's empty land. He was waiting for a dead man's living claim held by a dying old woman who has just given it to me. Silas Pickering put his hand over his eyes. Mrs. Ainsworth. Yes, I have been a fool for 11 winters. You have been a man, Mr. Pickering. There is a difference. The storm broke on the morning of the 15th of January, 1887. It broke not slowly, but all at once. The wind that had blown for 9 days simply stopped between one breath and the next, sometime in the deep cold before dawn. Tabitha woke to silence and did not believe it. She rose from her place beside the stove, and she stood very still in the middle of the room, and she listened in the silence held. She walked to the door. She pushed it open against the drifts. The sky was blue. It was not the soft blue of summer. It was the hard, crystalline blue of deep cold under deep, clear sky, the kind of blue that you only see at the bottom of the year, with the sun rising small and red in the east and casting long, sharp shadows across a prairie that had been remade. The drifts were mountains, 15 feet in places. The town was buried to its roof lines. The Pickering Soddy had vanished entirely beneath a long, smooth slope of snow that the wind had sculpted into a single perfect curve. Everything that had been familiar was gone. Everything that had been a road or a fence or a path had been erased. The thermometer beside the door read 22 below zero. It felt warm. She stood in the doorway with the cold air on her face, and she breathed, and her breath did not hurt, and the wind did not pull the breath out of her mouth before she could finish it. She breathed 3 times, 4 times. Then she turned back to the room. "It is over," she said. They came out one at a time. Silas Pickering with his children, Prudence Caldwell with a blanket wrapped over her ruined house dress, Ezra and Hattie blinking in the brightness, their eyes adjusted to 9 days of firelight and shadow. 8 people stepped out of a house that had been called a tomb into a morning that was the color of cut diamond. Silas Pickering stood for a long time looking at the place where his soddy had been. His son and daughter stood on either side of him. He did not speak. He did not need to. After a while, he turned and walked back inside, and Tabitha understood that he was not yet ready to begin the work of the spring. That was all right. There was time now. The county recorder's office reopened on the 23rd of January, after the road from the courthouse had been cleared. Tabitha walked into it on a Thursday afternoon with Silas Pickering on one side and Prudence Caldwell on the other, and she set 3 pages of paper down on the counter in front of Hollis Pemberton, who was the same clerk who had sold her the ruin in August. He read them. He read them twice. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Ainsworth." "Yes, Mr. Pemberton. This is a notarized salt claim filed in '84 by a man named Anders Holm. It covers your property and the 40 acres directly north of you. It has been continuously enforced since the date of filing." "That is correct." "And this is a deed transferring those 40 acres to you." "That is correct, Aunt." "And this is a sworn statement witnessed by yourself and Mr. Pickering and Mrs. Caldwell that a man named Jasper Cordell has been making offers to purchase property on this claim from widows in this county under false pretenses for a period of 2.5 years." "That is correct." Hollis Pemberton looked at the 3 papers. He looked at the 3 people standing in front of him. He looked last and longest at Tabitha. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I do not believe I have ever done a more pleasant piece of paperwork in my life." "Then file it, Mr. Pemberton." He filed it. Cordell came back to Russell on the 7th of April. He came in his chestnut and buggy in a clean wool suit with the same flat smile he had worn in August. He stopped first at the land office to inquire about the back tax status of the Hendricks ruin, which he had been told over the winter was likely to fall into county hands. Hollis Pemberton looked at him for a long time across the counter. Then Hollis Pemberton said, "Mr. Cordell, believe the sheriff has been waiting to speak with you for some weeks." The sheriff arrested Cordell at the door of the land office. The arrest itself was not dramatic. He did not run. He looked when the cuffs went on almost relieved, the way some men look when a long, quiet game finally ends. He was tried in Topeka in June. He was convicted on the strength of 3 sworn statements in an active mineral claim filed in 1884 that he should have known about and had carefully arranged not to know about, of fraud, of attempted misappropriation of public lands, and of 2 counts of solicitation to defraud widows, which were the strongest charges the territorial court had at the time for what he had been doing. He served 4 years. Tabitha did not attend the trial. She was building. By April, she had taught Silas Pickering how to read the marks on the limestone walls of the Hendricks ruin, and how to lay a sod roof on a stone foundation, and how to brace a ridge beam against the kind of snow load that had brought down his soddy. By May, she had taught the same to Prudence Caldwell, who had decided after losing the frame house her dead husband had built, that she would rebuild in stone on the same lot and would never again live under a roof made of wood. By June 14, families in the county had come to Tabitha to learn what she knew. She taught all of them. She charged none of them. The knowledge was not hers to sell, she said. When Prudence asked her once why she did not take fees, the stone was free, the sod was free, the knowledge was free, the work was the only thing that cost. She also did not become rich on the salt claim. She could have. She was offered twice large sums of money for the rights by men in suits who came out from Topeka looking apologetic about Mr. Cordell and hopeful that the new owner would be more reasonable. Tabitha listened to both offers. She declined both. She leased the rights instead on a small annual basis to a single Kansas company that paid her enough each year to feed her grandchildren through the winters and keep the stove burning, and to set aside slowly year by year a small sum that she did not touch that she said was for Ezra when he was grown. She did not tell Ezra what the sum was for until he was 19. It paid for his apprenticeship to a master stonemason in Kansas City. He was apprenticed for 7 years. He came home to Russell in 1903, 26 years old, with his journeyman's papers and his grandfather's chisel, and the chevrons cut into the handle of the chisel still visible in the worn wood, 3 of them set in a triangle the way Gerhardt Klein had cut them 60 years before in a yard outside Allegheny. Hattie married a wheat farmer named Calvin Reeves in 1900. They lived in Lincoln County. They had 4 children. The eldest was named Hester after no one Calvin had ever met. Silas Pickering rebuilt his house in stone in the spring of 1887. He did not remarry for 9 years. When he finally did in 1896, he married a widow from Lincoln County named Margaret Hatton, and they had 3 more children, and the children grew up calling Tabitha Grandmother Ainsworth, although they were not related to her by any blood. He named his second eldest daughter Mercy, and he taught her every year on the 15th of January the story of how her name had come to her. Prudence Caldwell lived in her stone house until 1908. She died at 63 of pneumonia in her own bed in a room Tabitha had helped her plan, with a southern window that looked out over the Russell churchyard where her 2 children were buried. The last thing she said to Tabitha, who was holding her hand, was, "I told you you were a fool." Tabitha said, "You did." Prudence said, "I was happy to be wrong." Then she closed her eyes. Tabitha buried her on a clear, cold afternoon in October. She never moved out of the ruin. She never rebuilt it into a proper house, never added rooms or windows or any of the improvements that other settlers made as the prairie was tamed and the railways came in and the towns filled up. She patched the sod every spring. She replaced the ridgepole twice in 1894 and in 1908. She kept the stove burning, and she kept the walls warm, and she kept the marks of Gerhardt Klein and his apprentice Anders Holm visible at the base of the eastern wall, and beside them, cut in the spring of 1887 by her own hand. With her late husband's chisel, she added 2 more marks. The first was a small cross for Edmund. The second was a careful capital H for Hester. She lived in the ruin for 34 more years. She died on the morning of the 20th of February, 1920, at the age of 96. She was found by Ezra, who had walked down from his own house in town to bring her breakfast, sitting in the rocking chair he had built her for her 75th birthday, facing the stove with her hands folded in her lap. The fire had burned down to embers, but the stones of the eastern wall where she had pressed to her palm on a hot August morning in 1886 were still warm to the touch. They stayed warm until late afternoon. That is what the stone does when you understand it. That is what the limestone of central Kansas does when it has been dressed by a master and laid by a master and warmed by the slow, patient fires of 34 winters. It holds. Ezra Reeves, master stonemason of Russell, Kansas, took down his grandfather's chisel from its peg above the stove on the afternoon of his grandmother's funeral, and he carried it outside, and he knelt at the base of the eastern wall, and he cut beneath Hester's H and Edmund's cross in the chevrons of Gerhard Klein one final mark. It was a capital T. It was for Tabitha. He cut it carefully the way she had taught him to cut a letter, with the patience and the balance that stone forgives nothing about and remembers everything about. Then he stood up. He put the chisel back into the small wooden box that had belonged to a man named Anders Holm. He closed the box. He carried it home. The walls stood another century. They stand still. If you know where to look, 300 yards west of what was once Russell, Kansas, 4 walls of fence-post limestone rising 7 feet from the prairie, blackened at the upper courses by a fire that burned long ago. The sod roof is gone. It was replaced in 1934 and again in 1962, and finally left open to the sky in 1981 when the last family who lived there moved into town. But the walls remain. They are 2 feet thick. They are dressed in the old way. At the base of the eastern wall, if you look carefully and the light is right, you will find 5 marks cut into the stone. 3 small chevrons in a triangle, a closed parenthesis, an ornate G, a small cross, a capital H, a capital T. A woman alone built a shelter out of a $5 ruin. She built it because she had no other choice. She built it because her husband had taught her about stone and her grandfather's master had taught her husband about stone, and because a stranger who had learned from the same master had cut the first stones of these walls 40 years ago and 2,000 miles away, and because the walls had been waiting all that time for someone who knew what they were waiting for. She kept 8 people alive in the worst storm in Kansas history. She broke a swindler. She taught 14 families to build the way she had built. She raised 2 grandchildren into a stonemason and a farmer's wife. She lived into a century she had not expected to see in a house she had not expected to build, with the marks of every person who had taught her or loved her or saved her cut into the wall beside her chair. She did it in a pile of rocks. She did it because on a hot August morning in 1886, she pressed her palm against a cool limestone wall, and she remembered something her husband had told her. And she chose against all the evidence, and all the warnings, and all the kind, concerned voices that told her it could not be done, to believe that the stone remembered too. The stone did remember. It remembers her still.